People think the hardest part of getting older is the aches and pains. The truth is, that's not the hard part. The hard part is when the house gets quiet. Not the quiet you choose. Not the Sunday afternoon kind when you make yourself a cup of tea and sit by the window on purpose. That kind of quiet is nice. That kind of quiet you earn. No, I mean the other kind. The quiet that just settles in on you like dust. You don't notice it coming, and then one day you look around and it's everywhere. I've lived alone long enough to learn a few things the hard way. And if there's one thing I wish someone had told me earlier, it's that living alone comes with a few traps. Most of them don't look dangerous at first. In fact, the worst ones feel comfortable. That line right there is worth sitting with for a moment.
Because I'm not talking about the obvious dangers. I'm not talking about leaving the stove on or forgetting your medication. Those things matter, yes, but the traps I'm talking about are quieter than that. They creep in through the back door while you're busy with something else, and by the time you notice them, well, you're already a good ways in. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm 85 years old, and I've been living in this house by myself for going on 14 years now, ever since Harold passed. This same house we moved into in 1974. Same windows, same creaky floorboard right outside the bathroom. I keep meaning to fix that, and I keep not doing it. At this point, I think we've just agreed to coexist. I've got a daughter in Cincinnati and a son over in Raleigh. Good people, both of them. They call, they visit when they can. I'm not one of those women who sits here feeling sorry for herself about that. Their lives are full and busy, and that's how it should be. I raised them to have their own lives. I just didn't fully think through what that would mean for mine. You know, late afternoon light in October is the most beautiful thing. The way it comes through at that low angle and just lays itself across everything like it's in no hurry. I never noticed it when Harold was here. There was always too much to do, too much to talk about. The house never got quiet long enough for me to pay attention to things like that. Now I notice everything. That's one thing nobody tells you about living alone. You get very observant. You know exactly when the refrigerator cycles on at night. You know which neighbor goes to work early and which one's car needs a new muffler. You know the sound of rain before it actually arrives because the house tells you. There's a particular creak in the east wall. You learn your life down to the very last detail, but you also learn your traps, and I've walked into most of them at least once, so let me tell you about them. The first winter after Harold died, I barely left this house for 2 months. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think a lot of women my age would understand exactly what I mean without me having to explain much. There's a kind of grief that doesn't push you toward people. It pulls you inward. And the house, especially a house you shared with someone for 40-some years, well, it holds you. It's familiar. Every corner of it knows your name. So I stayed in. I told myself it was winter, and it was winter. That part was true. But I also knew somewhere underneath all of it that going outside meant being a woman alone in the world, and I wasn't ready to be that yet. I'd get up in the morning, make my coffee, sit in Harold's chair. I started doing that after he passed, sitting in his chair instead of mine. I don't know quite why. Maybe I thought I'd feel him there. Maybe I did a little. Then I'd watch the morning news, then I'd putter around, then I'd have lunch standing at the kitchen counter, which is a habit I still haven't fully broken, then more television, then bed. And the next day, same again. Weeks went by like that. The strange thing about isolation is that it doesn't feel like isolation when you're in the middle of it. It feels like rest. It feels like protection. It feels honestly like the most reasonable response to a world that seems very large and very indifferent. But then something starts to happen to you, slowly, like a tide going out. You stop answering the phone, not because you decide to, you just don't get to it in time, and then you stop trying, and then eventually the phone stops ringing quite as often because people have lives and they can't keep reaching for someone who isn't reaching back. You stop answering the phone, and then eventually the phone stops ringing. The only one I was talking to regularly by February was my kettle. I'm not joking. I'd put it on and stand there and say, "All right, give me a minute," like it was going to argue with me. My neighbor, Patricia, she's about 10 years younger than me, good woman, stubborn as a fence post, she came over in March. I remember it was a Tuesday because I just watched my programs. She knocked and I almost didn't answer. I thought maybe she'd go away. She did not go away. She stood there and knocked again and then said, "Elizabeth May, I can hear your television. Open up." So I did, and she came in and looked around, and she didn't say anything dramatic, bless her heart. She just said, "You want to walk down to the pharmacy with me?" And I said I wasn't dressed for it, and she said, "You've got 10 minutes, I'll wait." That walk took about 20 minutes round trip, but I remember when I came back in, the house felt different. Not less quiet exactly, but the quiet was a different quality, like the air had moved. It took me a long time after that to understand what had almost happened to me in those months. Isolation doesn't announce itself. It just makes itself comfortable in your guest room and then quietly starts leaving its shoes in the hallway. The thing I've learned, and I learned it late, mind you, is that connection doesn't always feel necessary until after you've been without it long enough. You don't always feel like talking to people, but you need to do it anyway. Same as how you don't always feel like drinking water, but your body still needs it. Even small connections, a kind word to the woman at the post office, sitting where you can see other people at a cafe, even if you don't speak to a single one of them. A church service, not because you're thinking about scripture particularly, but because there are other human beings in the room, and something in you says, yes, this is right. Stay connected. Even when it's inconvenient, even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Now, this one I am not proud of. I want to preface this by saying I was a perfectly sensible woman for most of my life. I was not the kind of person who did foolish things. I raised 2 children. I managed a household for decades. I drove myself to every appointment. I balanced the checkbook. I fixed what could be fixed and called someone for what couldn't. But there is something that happens when you live alone and you get older, and it has to do with pride. A very specific kind of pride that I can only describe as the deep bone-level refusal to be seen as someone who cannot manage. Because if you can't manage, then maybe you shouldn't be living alone. And if you shouldn't be living alone, well, you know where that conversation goes. So you don't ask for help. You don't let people see the things you struggle with. You push through. You figure it out. You make do. And sometimes you do things that are frankly very stupid. There was an incident involving a step stool. I need the high cabinet for my good mixing bowls, the ones I use at Christmas, the blue ceramic ones Harold's mother gave us. They sit up on the top shelf because I don't use them often, and the top shelf is taller than I am by about 8 or 9 inches. I have a step stool, a sensible 2-step rubber-footed step stool that I have used 100 times. I know to be careful on it. I know to hold something with one hand. Did I do those things on this particular occasion? I did not. I was in a hurry. Don't even ask me why. What was I rushing toward? It's not like I had somewhere to be. And I climbed up both steps and then stretched for the bowl, and the step stool did what step stools do when old women treat them with too much confidence. I didn't fall. I want to be clear about that. I caught myself. I came down in a kind of controlled disaster, one hand on the counter, and I stood there in the kitchen for a good minute just breathing. Nothing hurt, nothing was broken, but I stood there and I thought, if I had fallen right now in this house with the door locked, my daughter in Cincinnati wouldn't have known until she called on Sunday. It was a Thursday. Pride is a funny thing. It makes you do very stupid gymnastics. And the older I've gotten, the more I've come to believe that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of intelligence. It is a sign that you have correctly assessed your own situation and made a smart decision, which is actually the very definition of managing. My son set me up with one of those medical alert buttons you wear around your neck. I resisted for about a year. I thought it looked like something out of a hospital catalog. I thought it was an admission of defeat. I wear it every day now. Because here's what I've understood. Staying independent doesn't mean refusing every hand that reaches for yours. It means being smart enough to stay safe so that independence is something you can actually keep. The women I know who refused all help, every single bit of it, most of them aren't living alone anymore because something happened and there was no one there to catch them. Accepting help when you need it is how you stay in your own house. That's not defeat, that's winning. Now this one is sneaky because it happens so gradually you don't even see it. At some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, my life started shrinking. Not dramatically, not all at once, just inch by inch, season by season, the way a sweater shrinks in the wash if you're not paying attention. You put it on one day and think, when did this happen? I stopped going to a few places because getting there had gotten complicated. The church I loved for 30 years moved their early service to a time that didn't suit me, and the later service ran too long, and then I started going less, and then once you stop the habit, it's harder to restart it than people think. I stopped going to the farmer's market because it meant parking 2 blocks away and walking, and some mornings my knees weren't interested in that negotiation. I stopped meeting my friend Louise for lunch because Louise's husband got sick and she couldn't really do it anymore, and I never found a replacement for that particular appointment in my week. And little by little, without my fully intending it, my world had gotten very small. I realized it on a rainy afternoon in November. I was sitting in this same chair looking around the room, and I thought I could walk across my entire life in house slippers. This living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the small back porch where I put my tomato plants in summer. That was it. That was the whole world. Now, I want to be fair to myself here. Some of that shrinking is just life. Friends get sick, circumstances change, your body changes what it can do and how easily it can do it. That's real, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. But some of it, more than I wanted to admit, was just that I had stopped trying. It had gotten easier to stay. And easy has a way of becoming permanent if you're not watchful about it. So I made myself a small promise. Nothing dramatic. I didn't sign up for anything. I didn't make a bucket list or a grand plan. I just told myself 1 new place a week. Somewhere I hadn't been in a while, or somewhere I'd never been, just to go, just to be somewhere that wasn't these 4 walls. The first week I went to the library. I used to love the library, and I had stopped going for no good reason I could name. I sat in there for an hour and a half and read 2 magazines and didn't speak to anyone except to say thank you to the young man who held the door. But when I came home, the house felt different, bigger somehow. The quiet in it felt like my quiet again, not just the absence of things. The next week, I found a small cafe that had opened about a mile from here, sat at a table by the window, had a pot of tea and a piece of lemon pound cake that was perhaps a little dry, but I wasn't going to complain. I watched the street. There is something remarkable about watching a street from inside a warm room, people walking past, a little girl being talked into keeping her mittens on, a man reading something on his phone, smiling at whatever it was, a dog determinedly sniffing a parking meter like it was the most important information he'd ever encountered. I felt like I'd been returned to something, like someone had drawn back the curtains. The world doesn't have to be big, but it has to be bigger than just your living room. Pause. If you've ever lived alone for a stretch of time, you probably understand exactly what I mean. Stay with me, though, because the last 2 lessons took me the longest to learn. I want to talk about something that is a little bit uncomfortable, but I think it needs to be said. When you live alone and when you are older, you become, whether you realize it or not, someone that certain people pay close attention to. Not in a good way, in the way that certain people are always looking for an opportunity. I don't want to make this sound sinister. Most people in this world are decent. My experience has been that most people mean you no particular harm. But there are some who look at an older woman living alone and see something they think they can use, her loneliness or her politeness or her old-fashioned sense that you trust people until they give you a reason not to. I was raised to be kind. I was raised to be helpful. I was raised to give people the benefit of the doubt. Those are good values. I don't regret any of them. But I learned the hard way over the course of a few different situations that kindness without boundaries is just an open door. There was a man who came to the door this spring, said he was doing landscaping in the neighborhood, had done work for several people on my street, could give me a very good deal on some mulch and tidying up the flower beds in front of the house. He seemed perfectly nice, polite. He had a truck. I said I'd think about it. He came back the next day and the day after that, and he kept getting more familiar, calling me by my first name, mentioning how much the work would normally cost and what a great deal he was offering me specifically. Something in me, some old quiet antenna that I almost talked myself out of listening to, kept saying, "Something is not right here." I called my son. He came over, talked to the man, and the man left and didn't come back. I still don't know exactly what that man's intention was, but I know that feeling I had in my stomach, and I know I almost ignored it because I didn't want to be impolite, because what if I was wrong? What if he was perfectly nice and I was just being a suspicious old woman? Here is what I've come to believe. At my age, I have earned the right to trust my instincts. I have been paying attention for 85 years. That counts for something. And kindness, real, genuine, beautiful kindness, doesn't require you to override your own gut feeling just to be polite to someone who is making you uncomfortable. There was also a period, I won't go into too much detail, where a distant relative came around quite a bit, and a lot of the conversations seemed to circle back around to money. Not dramatically, not obviously, just circling like a plane waiting to land. I handled that one myself, quietly. I simply became unavailable. I found that works quite well. Kindness is a beautiful thing. At my age, it truly is one of the things I value most in this world. But kindness also needs a lock on the door. You can be warm and welcoming and still protect yourself. Those things are not opposites. Talk to your children. Talk to a trusted friend. If someone in your life makes you feel uneasy, even someone you've known for years, you are allowed to pay attention to that. You don't owe anyone access to your home, your finances, or your peace of mind. Your own comfort in your own house is not something you should ever have to negotiate. This is the one I want to end with, because I think it's the most important one of all. Living alone isn't the problem. I want to say that clearly, because sometimes the way people talk about it, the way my children sometimes talk about it, with that careful, worried tone in their voices, makes it sound like a problem to be solved, like something went wrong and needs to be corrected. It's not a problem. It's a life. It is my life, and it is a full one, even if it looks quiet from the outside. But the trap, the real trap, the one I fell into without seeing, was spending so much time managing the difficulties of living alone that I forgot to actually build a life I enjoyed. There is a difference between surviving alone and living well alone. And for a few years after Harold passed, I was surviving. I was maintaining. I was getting through each week. I was keeping the house, keeping the bills paid, keeping myself upright and functional. But I wasn't really living, not the way I understand living now. Do you know what I do on Tuesday mornings? I water my plants. I have 11 of them. Too many, probably, for this size of window, but they're all doing just fine. I talk to them while I do it. I know people think that's eccentric. I don't particularly mind what people think. On Thursday afternoons, I read. Not self-improvement books, not things that are good for me. Novels. I like a good story. I like to lose myself in someone else's life for a few hours. I bake on Sundays if I feel like it, not because I need to, not because anyone's coming over, just because I like the way a kitchen smells when there's something in the oven. It changes the air. It makes the house feel inhabited. I write letters, actual letters, on actual paper, with stamps. I have 3 people I write to regularly. My college roommate who lives in Vermont, a woman from church who moved to Arizona for her daughter's sake but misses home terribly, and my granddaughter who is 23 and very busy and claims to love getting physical mail in the age of everything being electronic. I sit outside in the evening when the weather allows. I have a small porch chair, and I sit in it and watch the light change and listen to whatever birds are still around at that hour. Sometimes I think about Harold. Sometimes I think about nothing at all. Sometimes I think about what I'll have for dinner, which is not a spiritual thought, but is perhaps an equally necessary one. Small things. All small things. But here is what I've learned, and this is the thing I most want to pass on. You can live alone and still feel surrounded if your life is full of small things that matter to you. The size of the joy is not the point. The point is that it's real, that it's yours, that you made it on purpose. The loneliness, and I won't pretend it doesn't come because it does. It comes at particular times, late Sunday evenings especially, and sometimes in the middle of the night when the house makes a sound and there's no one to say, "Did you hear that?" The loneliness comes less often when your days have shape, when there are things you look forward to, even small things, especially small things. A friend of mine, she passed 3 years ago, I miss her still, she used to say that the secret to a happy life was having something to look forward to every single day. Not a vacation, not a grandchild's wedding. Every single day, something, even if it was just that she was going to read the next chapter of her book that evening, or that Tuesday was when her favorite show came on. She was 91 years old, and she was one of the most vivid people I have ever known. That's not an accident. I realize I've been sitting here talking for quite a while. You probably came with one question, and I've given you about 6,000 answers. That's what happens when you live alone. When you finally get to talk to someone, you make the most of it. Living alone isn't something to be afraid of. I want to be clear about that one more time before I finish. But it does ask something from you. It asks you to be honest with yourself about when you're retreating too far. It asks you to know the difference between chosen solitude and slow disappearance. It asks you to let people help you without feeling like you've lost something. It asks you to keep the door of your own life open, not to anyone who comes along, but to the things and people that are genuinely good for you. If you keep your world open, your heart steady, and your pride in check, you might find that living alone doesn't mean living lonely. It might mean, in fact, that you've finally gotten to know yourself, properly, with enough quiet to actually hear what's in there. And at 85, I can tell you, that is not a bad thing to have found. Not a bad thing at all.